Our theme for the month, you may have guessed, is ministry. In our not too distant past, the person who occupied the role of minister or pastor was commonly referred to as parson, as in that familiar song, "In the meadow we will build a snowman and pretend that he is Parson Brown." And the parsonage was where the parson lived. The word parson comes from the Old English and simply means person. So it could be said that the work of a minister is to be a person for a living, which is a tall order in our capitalist society where we're accustomed to identifying persons by their profession or vocation: teacher, doctor, lawyer, accountant, librarian, social worker, therapist, barista, plumber, construction worker. In other words, we have a tendency to identify each other and sometimes ourselves by what we do rather than who we are. A few years back, I took a cab from the airport to my home in Tucson, Arizona, where I was serving the UU congregation there at the time. It was one of those days when I arrived tired to the bone, and so I said a silent prayer as I opened the door to the cab. "Good Lord, please save me from chatty cab drivers. Grant me a quiet ride home." Apparently, the answer to that prayer was no. The driver asked the usual questions about how my flight was and what brought me to Tucson. You've all heard that question. What brought you to Nashville, perhaps? So I told him that I had come to Tucson for work, this time hoping more than praying that he wouldn't ask what kind of work. Which he did, of course. He asked politely and innocently, "What kind of work do you do?" When I said, "I'm a minister," he said, "Sweet, how easy is that?" I swear to you, that's what he said. Well, yes, my job is sweet. I love what I do, but I wouldn't exactly call it easy. And then he said, "Well, at least you only have to work for an hour a week." Any teachers here who've heard that at least you get 3 months off in the summer? You know this one. To which I replied, "I know that's how it looks from the outside, but if I'm not diligent about keeping my schedule, I can easily put in 50 or more hours a week." "Really?" he said with a curious and somewhat suspicious tone. "What do you do for all that time?" "Well, let's take that 1 hour a week, Sunday worship. It will probably surprise you to know that that 1 hour takes about 20 hours of preparation." He thought about that one for a minute and then said, "You mean you don't just open the Bible, read something, and talk about it?" "Well, no." And in that moment, I decided that I wasn't even going to try to explain Unitarian Universalism and our many sources of truth and wisdom. Instead, I said, "A well-crafted sermon takes at least 8 hours to write." "Okay, that's 8 hours, not 20, he challenged. "What do you do with the rest of the time?" "Well, there's the study and research I do before I even start writing. Then there's finding the readings and choosing the hymns, working with lay people who will participate in the service, coordinating with the accompanist, and the musicians arriving early to do a sound check, to make the audio-visual system, make sure it's working properly. And before I could continue, he said, okay, that's 20 hours. But you said 50 or more. This time the disbelief was obvious. Then, of course, there's weddings and funerals. Oh yeah, I forgot about that. I bet they take more time than I think, right? Said probably, and then there's the pastoral care. What's that? So much of our world is unchurched, right? So these were the honest questions. He says, pastoral care, what's that? Well, for example, I visit people in the hospital. I wish I could do more, but it could be a full-time job in itself in my congregation. So I focus on people who are seriously ill or in hospice care. For everybody else, I try to make sure that they're getting attention from the congregation with cards, visits, maybe meals if they need them. We have lay ministers and a caring committee that does those things. And when people are going through a difficult time, I try to make time either by phone or in my office. Wow, he said, I had no idea. Then there's all the meetings. I was on a roll now. Meetings? What kind of meetings? Well, there's staff meetings and the board of trustees and more committees than you can imagine. Oh, he said, suddenly becoming very quiet. So I thought it wasn't a good idea to tell him about writing newsletter columns and dealing with email and attending interfaith events and doing denominational work and worrying about broken air conditioners and unbalanced budgets, since he didn't ask. Just as we were pulling up to my house, the cab driver had one last question. So how do you like living in Tucson? To which I replied, I love it here. The heat doesn't bother you? No, I can take the heat. At that point, we had arrived at my house. I paid the fare and thanked the cab driver, and as he pulled away from the curb, I realized that he was driving away, knowing more about what a minister does, but not what ministry is. What I would have liked to tell him is that every minute spent preparing for this sacred hour of worship is a holy moment spent wrestling with matters of the Spirit, that each meeting is an encounter with the divine, enfleshed in human bodies, that each ceremonial rite of passage is a blessing and a time of deep connection, that everything a minister does is in service of creating community in order to bring more love and more justice into the world. Gordon McKeeman, who was a prominent Universalist minister of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, said that ministry is a quality of being in community that affirms human dignity. Ministry is all we do together. Living at a time as we do, living at a time and in a society that too often equates worth with wealth and increasingly place value on only those who contribute to economic growth and wealth, a society that too often reduces people to the value of their labor, a society that is increasingly denying rights and therefore dignity to more and more categories of people, pushing more and more people to the margins. Our ministry, as a people of faith who dare to proclaim the inherent worth and dignity of every person, is needed now more than ever. Naomi Shihab Nye wrote a book of poetry for children, Everything Comes Next. I love that title. And it is in that book that I found the poem Common Funeral Myths, which speaks a truth that isn't named often enough. In the line of the poem that says, each of you is mourning the same individual, which to me means that we only ever know a limited aspect of any one person's life. And the truth is that everyone is more than a single identity, more than a job title, more than they earn, more than the roles they fill in their families and communities, more than a single story. The thing that I have come to cherish about memorial services, the ones that I attend and the ones that I officiate, is that through the obituaries, the eulogies, and the stories that are shared, the wholeness of that person's life shines through. It's like the Hindu fable, where an elephant is described by 5 visually impaired people, each describing only what they can feel and touch from where they are. It takes all of them together to understand the whole elephant. Brian Stevenson, author of the book Just Mercy, is often quoted as saying, "Everyone is more than the worst thing they have ever done." And I would add to that everything is more than the best thing they've ever done. No one life can be reduced to a single narrative. We are all much more complex than that. We are all like multifaceted gems. To see only one facet of who we are is to miss the beauty of the whole. And this, to me, is what ministry is all about. The ministry that we do together, seeing and being seen, hearing and being heard, understanding and being understood, inviting and being invited into full personhood. It's the inherent worth and dignity of every person who is part of an interdependent web of life, human wholeness being called into beloved community. And that, my friends, is ministry. And ministry is all we do together. May it be so. May we make it so.